Hi there, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of week 9. So, for this video, I'm going to do a little bit more detailed explanation of the 3 readings that you engaged with this week. And so, this is going to be kind of our survey of empiricism while we're, for the next few weeks afterwards, going to be doing a deep dive on Hume specifically, kind of like how we did on Leibniz, where we just try to go through a major text and go through all the individual parts of it and try to get a very clear picture of what Hume is up to. And by the way, if this looks a little busy right now, that's okay. Hopefully it'll be clearer in just a minute. Now, so what all of the empiricists basically agree upon is the importance of sensation, perception, and experience for our knowledge. But the thing is that they have vastly different pictures of what goes on in sensation, perception, and experience. And so in order to get a handle on that, we need to maybe just think about a specific situation, and then we can go over how each philosopher interprets a situation. So what I've tried to just draw in various iterations is myself, and I get a new book, woohoo, new book, and I am happy that I have a new book. I have a perception of the book, and I think that it smells really good, right? It has that new book smell. Okay, so that's a situation where, I am perceiving something, and so now we can get into the breakdown of various ways that the different philosophers sort of thought about that relationship. So let's start out with Locke. Locke is actually the most complex of the pictures that we see here, but it's also the most intuitive, straightforward, common sense, all that kind of stuff. In a lot of ways, you could say that Locke sort of has one out in the sense of that he captures the best are sort of, you might hear, pre-theoretical intuitions. So how you think about the world before you start doing philosophy, right? And so in that way, John Locke is the best, but in another way, he sort of has the weakest empiricism in the sense that he is willing to say that there are the most entities that maybe we don't have direct perceptual awareness of. And part of Locke's motivation is to try to make sense of a metaphysical picture. So whenever I perceive something, say the book or something like that, what's going on, right? Okay, so here's the most common sense view, I think. So what Locke says is, okay, Penny, she's gonna look at a book, right? And so I'm looking and I'm smiling because I'm very happy about the book, and I'm looking at the book here. And so what's going on is that there's an object, which is the book itself, which is the cause of my perception. It's only possible for me to see the book because it's actually there, right? And then what happens is then I form a mental representation or a picture of what the book looks like. And importantly, there are some differences between the object as it is in itself and the object as it occurs as a product of my representation, my thought of it, right? And Locke's general idea is that there are two kinds of qualities. There are primary qualities, which are the qualities that belong to the object itself. And then there are what he calls secondary qualities, which are qualities that come not from the object on its own, but specifically how the object interacts with me as the subject, right? And so what I've tried to draw here is, okay, there's a book, there's the object as it is in itself, and then there's me, the subject, right? And then I form a representation of it, right? And the object itself is the cause of my representation of it, right? And so this is a causal relationship that's drawn out this way from the object to my representation. And then there's a resemblance relationship between my representation and the object in cases of veridical perception. So what that means is just that when I, have a veridical case of perception and the perception matches up to the way that the world really is, right? Then what my representation resembles reality in various respects. Okay, so that's like a good picture. Here are some of the benefits of the picture, right? It clearly allows for the possibility of optical illusions, right? Through this idea of secondary qualities, right? It allows us to, it sort of captures what we think, which is that there's a real thing, namely the book, and then I see it, right? And then I form a mental representation of it. And if the mental representation is good and not like confused or something like that, then it should resemble the book that I originally saw, right? And so these are the various things that I've sort of listed here. Now, importantly, basically the impetus for Locke's project here is to say that, okay, what belongs to the object itself are the sort of properties or characteristics that we can investigate through physics, right? And so the things that are primary qualities, the things that belong to the object itself, are things like shape, size, shape, size, things of that nature, right? Figure, those sorts of things, right? The sort of thing that would be relevant for, doing a physical investigation of the world. And then there are a whole host of other properties or qualities that we can call secondary qualities. And these are qualities that emerge because of the object's interaction with me, right? So like in this case, I've tried to draw out some important differences between the object and the representation, right? In this case, the object isn't colored, right? For Locke, color doesn't belong to an object in itself, but it sort of reflects our ability to process light, right? Through our own visual apparatus, right? And so if we think about the way that the world really is outside of the perspective that we might have on it, then it's probably, Locke believes, like a colorless world. Similarly, smell is another case where Locke thinks that this is a secondary quality. This is a quality that interacts with, our own evaluation. So I smell the book and I'm like, oh my gosh, it has that new book smell. I'm so excited, all that kind of stuff. And that's a judgment that I make, right? But the fact that the book smells good, that's more of a judgment about the way that I receive the book rather than a judgment about the way that the book really is, right? And moreover, Locke thinks that you can explain secondary qualities through primary qualities. And if, you might remember from way back whenever we read Galileo in week 1, Galileo had a brief discussion about how like things like taste and smell, right? What's going on in those senses is like small particles, go in our mouth or in our nose, right? And this causes a distinct kind of sensation that, our brain or body or maybe ourself judges to be good or bad, right? And so the primary qualities have a causal relationship with the representation. They cause us to represent the thing in a certain way. And so, you can give a scientific explanation of what the new book smell really is. It's like, I have no idea what this explanation would look like, but I'm sure that it has something to do with like how the pages are printed and all that kind of stuff, to say that, it lets out the smell that hits your nose and that causes that sensation where you're like, yay, it smells good, right? And so Locke's picture is very complicated because you have an object, right? This then causes the subject to have a certain kind of representation, or Locke calls them ideas. And then in positive cases, in normal cases, in veridical cases, that representation resembles in some ways the object. But it only resembles it in some respects, right? Because obviously some of the features that are part of my representation, right, namely, yay, it smells good, right, are not actual features of the object as it exists on its own in itself, right? And so here we have an important distinction between primary and secondary qualities, and Locke thinks that he's mapped out in a basically scientific fashion. Okay, here's how it is, how we get from physics, which is an examination of bodies and their interaction, how physics can explain all of the relevant features of our secondary qualities too, you know, how things smell and look and what sort of value judgments that we make about them, right? Physics can be sort of the explanation behind those things, right? And so that's John Locke's basic picture. Now, basically what we're going to see as we move, you know, down the chart from Berkeley to Hume is we're going to see addition by subtraction. And what I mean by that is that they are going to, in some ways, sort of purify the empiricism of John Locke's account of perception, but by removing various aspects of his analysis. So, for example, here we have Barclay. Barclay and Locke were actually both very important for like America. They both were in, I think Barclay himself actually came to America, so like the UC school, UC Berkeley, that's named after him, right? John Locke, very important for the founders and their political philosophy, the American Revolution, all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of interesting. Now, one thing that Barclay thought that was very interesting is he basically takes Locke's picture, right, where there's an object, a subject, and representations, and he gets rid of the idea of an object, right? And his arguments for that go like this. He says, okay, well, number one, you have no idea what it is for something to exist as an object independently of your interaction with it, right? Locke ultimately, according to Barclay, has no reason for thinking that you know, extension, figure, shape, and so on are primary qualities and they belong to the object as it is in itself, regardless of our perceptions, because strictly speaking, Berkeley's empiricism makes him state that, hey, you know, the only thing that we have knowledge of are things that we sense or experience, right? And we don't experience what the object is outside of our interaction with it, right? We only experience the object as a representation. So, you know, what Barclay would say is like, okay, yeah, you know, you got this book and, you know, you feel this way about it, like, yay, it smells good, right? But you don't have any picture of what the book is like outside of any possible representation of the book, right? Or the book as it is outside of any perceiver or observer, right? And in fact, you can't even really think about what that would entail or what that would involve. Like what, you don't have the ability to like kind of jump outside of your own head and determine, oh, okay, here are the qualities that, you know, happen because of my perspective, and here are the qualities that happen because of the way that they are in the object. And part of Barclay's argument is he wants to say, well, actually, the arguments that you use to say that smell and taste and value judgments and so on are actually secondary qualities actually apply equally well to what Locke calls primary qualities, right? Because the shape, size, extension, right, of a given figure actually depends on the perspective that you have of it, right? And so this too, like anytime that you imagine any sort of object, you always do it from a certain sort of perspective, right? I can imagine the book like this, I can imagine the book like this, and so on, right? But I can't imagine what it would be like to have like, you know, all of those perspectives at once, or to have a view on the book without it being, you know, one profile of the book, right? And so all I have are perceptions. I don't have access. I don't have any epistemological access to how the object is in itself. So Berkeley says, esse est percepti, which means that what is what is perceived. To be is to be perceived. So the book only exists as my representations of it. It doesn't exist independently of all of those kinds of representations, right? It doesn't have a kind of independent substance or reality. And Berkeley was only able to suggests this because of the empiricism given by John Locke. John Locke wants to say, hey, you shouldn't postulate the existence of substances like God or something like that you don't have any sensation or perception or impression of, right? Then Berkeley says, well, this applies equally well to your conception of what objects are, namely as things that exist outside of any sort of perception or representation, right? So Berkeley thinks that the only things that exist in the universe are perceivers and perceptions. That's it. There's perceivers and there are perceptions. There's no cause of perceptions outside of the perceiver, right? And there's nothing that you can really encounter that avoids this sort of framework. So one thing you might think is like, okay, but if I close my eyes, the book is still there, right? Even though I closed my eyes. So it seems like it didn't just like pop in and out of existence depending on whether or not I saw it, right? And so this might be the object permanence objection to Berkeley. That Berkeley makes it seem like all objects only exist because we see them, but there are lots of moments where we don't see them, right? So what justifies him in saying that they continue to exist? Well, you have our good friend God back again, okay? And basically what Berkeley says is that God is a perceiver, and not only is God a perceiver, but God is actually the best perceiver, and so God perceives everything. And so if you're wondering why it is that the book in this case doesn't just pop out of existence and pop back into existence or something like that, that's because it was perceived, right? But it wasn't perceived by me, it was perceived by God. And Berkeley actually thinks that the permanence of objects is a proof for the existence of God, funnily enough. Because if you had this picture where there are only perceivers and perceptions, then you'd have no explanation for the continuity of perceptions or the continuity between perceivers, right? But kind of in some ways similarly to Leibniz, God sort of makes sure that everything has stability and harmony and things sort of stay the way that they are. And so Berkeley's point of view is interesting. It's interesting because it's a radicalization of Locke, right? Where you have at least one element of Locke's philosophy, his empiricism, and it's used against his commitment to the existence of independent objects, right? And so in some ways, Berkeley's like kind of picture of the world is really dissatisfying, right? Like we don't think that all that exists are perceivers and perceptions, at least, not normally, right? If you're not in your philosophy bag, then you probably don't believe that, right? But it seems like if you are a consistent, thoroughgoing empiricist, then you don't have any justification for referring to this thing in itself, this thing how it is independently of any possible representation or perception. So that's Berkeley. And so here you might see Hume has even less, right? Hume doubts the reality of the perceiver or subjects. Namely, he doubts that there's anything like what all of the philosophers that we've read so far maintain, which is that there is something like an intellectual substance, that there is some underlying reality for us, that I think one student in the midterm referred to us as akin to a vessel, and the thoughts are like liquid, right? And so we contain thoughts in the same way that the vessel contains liquid. And I think that this is like a good way of describing how every other philosopher thinks about personal identity, right? And the idea of intellectual substance is that they're like the container for the thoughts and representations that we happen to have. And that's definitely how Berkeley thought of it, right? All perceptions imply a perceiver, right? And that's partially why you have the big perceiver, which is God, right? Now, Hume is super interesting because Hume says, okay, I'm an empiricist, so I will only allow for things that I have distinct sensations of. So in what you're describing, I have a sensation of the book. I have, the sensation, the positive sensation, the happiness, the color of the book, and so on, right? But I don't have any impression of what it is to be a perceiver, or what it is to be a subject, or what it is to be an intellectual substance. There's no impression that corresponds to this. And so in the same way that we had to abandon the existence of independent objects of experience, now Hume asks us in an even more radical fashion to abandon even the idea of a subject that functions as something like a container for these representations or perceptions or impressions, right? For Hume, all we have are impressions, right? We don't have any ability to separate out these impressions according to like a certain kind of perceiver, right? Something that we think contains the perceptions, nor do we have anything like an object that is the cause of these impressions. All we have is one impression after another. If we're going to be really strict about our empiricism. And so that's a really interesting idea, right? That goes against everything that we've read so far this semester. It goes against the very idea of the cogito, right? Very notion of intellectual substance or personal identity, right? And in this way, Hume really resembles a lot of Buddhist philosophers who maintain that the self is like a kind of illusion, right? Hume thinks that like one way that we try to, customarily sort of like make sense of the impressions that we have is that we postulate the existence of a perceiver and we postulate the existence of an object that's the cause of our representations, right? But that if we are empiricists, then we don't have any sensation that we can trace this idea back to. And so it's ultimately no more justifiable than, any of the crazy rationalist reflections on God or anything like that. And so it's interesting what you see in the empiricist is because you kind of move from, I think, Locke, who is the most intuitively plausible, the most connected to the science of his day, right? But you can actually see how the commitment to empiricism actually requires that he abandon this stuff, or at least that other figures who, took themselves to be empiricists to abandon these sort of postulates. And so basically what we're going to be investigating for the next 3 or 4 weeks is really the viability of this sort of perspective. Hume developed this analysis in Treatise on Human Nature, which is an early work that he published. A lot of people think that this is like the best piece of philosophy that has ever been published, which is not an exaggeration. Like they literally believe that. And it's funny because the book was like completely panned and ignored, and Hume almost like gave up philosophy because of it. He had a lot more success like as a historian of England rather than a philosopher. And so he developed this on the Treatise on Human Nature, and then later he went back and sort of rearranged his beliefs, sort of presented his philosophy again, specifically his reflections on epistemology, in a treatise on the inquiry concerning human knowledge. And so that's the text that we're going to read all the way through, because the treatise on human nature is like 500 plus pages, right? So we're going to go through that one and see, okay, what does this super, super slimmed down picture of the world really justify? Where does it get us in terms of the things that we are justified in saying? If we take empiricism to be if we take the most rigorous, most distilled form of empiricism, what kind of knowledge are we left with? That's going to be kind of the remaining question for the next few weeks. Hope this helped.